To conclude the formal talks for today, it's my pleasure to introduce Terry Smith. I won't dwell. Terry is, of course, the just retired Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Art History at Pitt, and of course, the former Power Professor and Emeritus Professor at the University of Sydney. Very well known to you all for works particularly focusing on Australian art, but also the notion of contemporaneity. I'm going to hand over to Terry. I think your title is right here: Arts, Powers, Multiplicity, and Movement. Terry, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody who's organised today's session. I'm just getting this so I can see. Also, I'd like, of course, to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples whose land on which we stand, on which we meet today. The Gadigal people is where I live and work now. I'm happy to visit here, and I thank you for the welcome. We've learned an enormous amount today. My job is to hopefully echo a lot of what's been said and add a few other thoughts. Let me begin in a kind of general way, and then I'll get down to more particulars. So can you hear clearly up to back? Is that okay? Great.
Yes.
Project. All right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. When we think about power and inequality together as pairs in a dialectic, we're probably picturing concentrations of the former as naturally and necessarily bringing about the latter as a condition of existence for most people. When we throw art into the mix, we might be wondering about how art, despite the myriad ways in which it's made and circulated in the world, is subject to this exchange in some shared sense. So within the main currents of Western or North Atlantic art discourse, which favours views of art as largely self-focused, disinterested practice, the operations of power are usually noted in the rare occasions when artworks make direct and measurable impact on overt political events, or when external powers make an impact on art practice, on artworks, or their distribution. But as Grant Kester has recently shown in his latest 2 books on the question of autonomy, he's pointed out that another conception of art's autonomy has actually been in play since the Enlightenment, since it was articulated by Schiller. That's to say, art made from positions of critical independence, art that acts by picturing aspects of power's operations, or by demonstrating the value of something else. For example, a more equal way of living in the circumstances. So, obviously, over the centuries, many artists have enacted both kinds of autonomy, and many more, as we've seen today, continue to do so at present. So this pairing, art as an instrument of given social power, vis-a-vis picturing the truth to power, that pairing has been a powerful analytic until recently. I think under contemporary conditions, it requires supplementation. And the papers we've heard today have demonstrated this different kinds of supplementing the double, the dialectic, in all sorts of ways. I agree totally with the suggestions by Tony and the organisers of this session. Foucault's analyses of the operations of micropowers clearly should refine Bourdieu's account of the power in structures, those that shape fields of production, including art making and its distribution. As has been pointed out, both were conceived on the cusp of the shift from modern to contemporary art. So the 60s, 70s is the moment of worldwide shift in different ways from modern to contemporary art. That shift is still unfolding. So we've got to refine these 2 models. So I'm going to argue that despite certain appearances, in fact, the most spectacular and diverting appearances, in other words, despite the dominance of the market and all those definitions of what art is today, it's not the fixing of singularities, but it's the convergence within multiplicity that drives most art production and exchange. In short, multiplicity and movement, what I call the manifold prevails over singularity and fixity when it comes to the disposition of power and value in the visual arts today, I'd suggest. I just want to give you 2 examples of that in the time I have available. So for millennia, Indigenous clans living in the Gulf of Carpentaria had negotiated with each other and with outsiders, traded with other Aboriginal clans elsewhere on the continent, and at least since the 17th century with fishermen, specialists in what we call sea cucumber from Makassar and Sulawesi, obviously now in Indonesia, as well as occasional explorers and traders from European countries. They maintained relative isolation on the continent and, until their area or their country was invaded by the British settler colonists in the late 19th century. This invasion of cattlemen failed, but the arrival of missionaries and anthropologists in the 1920s opened up a different type of negotiating space that interested the Yolŋu clans, as it mainly concerned trade in knowledge and law, in which theology and art, painting, songs and rituals were the primary medium of exchange. So amongst other things, these exchanges were a means to the clans for them to assert their sovereignty. Thus, on Elcho Island in 1957, Yolŋu elder Barumura brought together a display of the sacred ranga, now known as the Elcho Islands Memorial. That's not part, sorry. The cross is not part of it. The cross is in the background. So what's being seen is the key objects of sacred knowledge shown for a while in that particular place. The political gesture involved was to call for this, or it was his call to other Yolŋu to cease internal fighting and to form unity in the face of the greatest threat to their life and environment. Substantial bauxite reserve was discovered near Yirrkala, a little bit, in fact, in the 1930s, but really nailed down in the early 1950s. So during the 50s, 60s, 70s, the government moved to resume a section of the peninsula for mining and for shipping, and in 1968 sold the rights of this area near Yirrkala to the Balco, a Swiss extraction company, which commenced operations in 1971. The Yirrkala Church Panels were painted obviously in this place, in the church you just saw here. This is the Yirrkala Church, and it still looks pretty much like that today. Yirrkala Church Panels were painted there in 1962-63, following a proposal from the local elder in Ancestral to the new minister, the Reverend Edgar Wells. The panels were shown when the church opened in March 1963. That's Wells, that's narrative in church. The panels you can glimpse, I'll show you them in a bit more detail in a moment. Now, I've written about these at some length in an article on efflux, so I'll focus here on the power plays that are in play right here. We know from his autobiography, in fact, in a book written by his wife, that Wells was committed to supporting Yolŋu rights against commercial exploitation. He was against the government deceiving the people. He was as committed to that as he was to converting them to Christianity. We also know from the fact of the paintings that I'll show you in a moment, and the artist statements and their subsequent political interventions using artworks, that the elders took the opportunity to affirm their traditional knowledge, its presence in the land, and its power, as you see. Now, making, as Howard Morphy puts it, for visits to the church to be able to see the ways in which the paintings mapped their rights in land and also apprehended the sense in which land was a sacred endowment. That's a photograph taken by a school teacher in 1963, as you see. The powers, this is another kind of power, was spoken about not just under the heading of autonomy. And this, I don't think, is a slip back into wishful disinterestedness. The powers embodied in the painting claim our attention. There are two distinct complementary moieties amongst Yolŋu. It's a basic division in Yolŋu society, Dua and Yirrkala. there that the core stories of these workings are embodied in these paintings. The imagery, the signs, they picture ancestral beings, they picture their stories, they picture the sacred places, and they project the powers inherent in all of those to us through the painting. As at Elko, the elders have taken the rare step of revealing the most secret aspects of their knowledge. The bottom right-hand section of the Yirrkala panel shows Barama, is very rarely shown at that time. He's painted much often said. One of the founding ancestors, Barama, here, arriving from the north and creating the land as you see it and everything on it. There's 4 created beings that are all emerging from a particular sacred water hole. Alongside him are the 3 others. And above him is the 4th, this guy, Leura. The diamond shapes ubiquitous in Yirrkala representation originate from the first appearance of these beings, foamy water running off the backs of their bodies as they emerge from the sea, and from their weed-covered bodies as they emerge from water holes. Sunlight shining through the droplets, represented by the white paint, signals sacred presence. It's like the lightning of the sky in a flash during a monsoon storm. The diamonds, slightly modified in shape, can also represent honeycomb, fire, running water, or be a mortuary sign. What's most striking here is that all of these figures, they are the most sacred figures, are being shown at the moment they were doing the most important thing that was ever done for Yirrkala people. The most important thing that will ever be done, that is, create place, create this world. The created beings are being shown as they first appeared, when appearance became possible, when there was first something to see, something to be seen. So the invitation to contemporary spectators in 1963 and since has been to witness the creation of these places, this world, as it happened in the first instance. And that's a staggering thing you can do if you go to Yirrkala and look at these panels now in the Art Centre. In terms of the local political play, the most powerful thing about the panels is that this was the first time, at least as we known to Bowen, the white people, that the clans of the region had come together on such a scale to produce one thing and with such a single and shared purpose. So the panels, historically, might be said to mark the first appearance of the clans together as Yolŋu as such. This is our dreaming, each panel says. Each of these little panels, painted by a separate person. Each of these panels say, this is the dreaming of my particular clan. This is the dreaming of all of us together as Yolŋu. It says we're living in our shared differences. We're living side by side. So it's not only a statement of power, it's a statement about power, as it should be disposed within the Yolŋu community. Now, as it happened, in 1963, the panels were in the church, as I've shown you, during the visit of parliamentarians who were charged with making recommendations for or against mining. One of them, Kim Beazley Sr., a Labor Party politician from Western Australia, recommended that the Yolŋu use them as a basis for a petition to Parliament. They came up with a smaller version, painting the type text of their petition, "Don't mine our lands, our country." One doer again, and one Yirrkala. Surrounding them with borders painted by Narrogin, with permission from the other elders, the same ones who did the church panel. So while these particular petitions were unsuccessful in stopping the government granting the lease, the High Court acknowledged that a claim to sovereignty was being made, one impossible to grant under the principle of terra nullius, as we've heard before, that the publicity around that refusal contributed towards a broader public consciousness that Indigenous people actually had beliefs about their land that they could represent it in stunning, interesting, attractive and powerful ways, and that their belief was one about primary ownership. And as we know, it took until 1992 for the case to be brought by Eddie Mabo of the Mir Island and Torres Strait for the High Court to rule that native title actually existed. Of course, such title remains contested all the time, but artworks continue to be recognised by the courts as the basis for claiming such titles. Okay, so it's a clear example of how a multiplicity of powers converge in time and place, and they generate this manifold. Now I'll turn to another example. What's my timing?
You've got 13 minutes.
13 so far. I need another 5 or so, maybe more. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So when it comes to artistic reputation, forming and representation, I want to speak about some work of Imants Tillers. Tillers, and I chose him as an example because he's from 1981. He named all of his work the Book of Power. So every individual work is a page in the book, and every individual work of his consists of different pages in the books. I'll actually speak off the images thing. I've got so little time, forget the text. He's inspired in terms of the book by this famous unfinished work by Stefan Mallarmé called The Book. Mallarmé is famous for generating this poems by elements thrown together. As you see, the throw of the dice will never abolish chance. This inspired Imants in many, many of his works, and he uses that phrase around many, many of his works. In this case, to look about the concept of horizon. That's the power of landscape within the consciousness of this country. Going back to one of Tony's points, if you like, the white consciousness of being here but where we shouldn't be, being on the edge of the country and having a great interior, that sort of double, the tension that double, is very much embodied in our history of landscape painting. That's why landscape is so dominant, so powerful within our visual imaginary. Imants, being the son of Latvians and himself an immigrant, produced works that, using the conceptual technique of repetition and assembly and appropriating images from elsewhere, except I just had an email from him, which I have here. I can read it to me, but I won't say. I asked him, I know we got to do the book from. Where did you get Of Power from? He said, that's my own thing. He said, I realized that in the accumulation of images, there was a certain power, and that's the power of accumulated images. So in the very big paintings, all of it consists of tiny panels, which is then assembled like these huge paintings. He can address enormously important, very political subjects about the operations of power, including, in this case, the experience of the diaspora, which is relating to the life of Christ, the Stations of the Cross, and so on and so forth. I shall keep going with images. And he's done a whole series called Diaspora, which continues to keep being repeated. This one done just a few years ago after, of course, the fires that consumed a good part of Western Australia. Then, if you look around here, throw the dice will never abolish chance is repeated. So it keeps generating an art practice that grows out of itself. It's an art practice that's absorbed this energy of the kind embodied by us Australians' idealisation of Australia, the idea of the colonisation of Australia, the pastoralisation of Australia, but also at cost. The cost of in fact, destroying a good part of the country is also indicated by Australia, even at this earliest stage. Finished just by talking about 2 more works, because it's the relationship to Indigenous art practice, the interplay between Indigenous and non-Indigenous art. And what's gradually become the case, Marina's seen it with the examples chosen in all the papers today, all of which were Indigenous artworks, except the ones that I've seen, has become Australian art imaginary and Australian art world to become dominated by Indigenous art for very good reason. It's absolutely most of it's outstanding and so pertinent to us. But what has meant non-Indigenous artists have been obliged to respond to it. There are many different ways which others have responded, one of which, in the case of Imants, is applying his rule of appropriation and absorbing. But of course, he got enormous pushback from Indigenous artists and other people, including myself, about randomly appropriating. So it's actually developed these negotiations that work between him and Michael Nelson Tjapaltjarri and other artists. It's very contested and difficult, but it exists. And what has generated this kind of field, if you like, productive field, that's actually in the work and keeps generating its own connection, disconnections, referring back to the Leura. This particular painting is drawn from a great painting by Michael Tiller and Tjapaltjarri. Griffith did the points and sights. This is Tiller's journey through his lands using previous paintings of his, including the staff system and a dead figure of one of his uncles, meditation on his own life, commissioned by Jeffrey Barden for a film. In fact, I think that Jeffrey did, in fact, film. So these are examples of the play of power that operates between non-Indigenous and Indigenous artists in our culture. My final point, Mark, is that there's also a sense in which the entire, what used to be called Aboriginal contemporary art movement, we now just call Indigenous art in general, that entire movement has had a very powerful political function in this country. It's been blunted in recent years, but in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, the fact that Indigenous people could produce such extraordinary art time and time again and keep replenishing and regenerating that kind of practice throughout the country had enormous impacts in terms of reconciliation and impacting upon the fundamentally racist policy of non-Indigenous people in this country. So the next that of course the patent had to be done around the Leura statements in the heart. And it's a wonderful thing, as Jennifer said before, that this circulates between communities. In this case, doesn't go into a museum. That's the kind of shift. It would have gone into a museum about 20 years ago. So those things, we have an example of whole art movement having social power. And I also tried to show you how that's partly as a result, mainly of individual artworks and individual artists creating works that are in themselves enormously powerful. Thank you.